高峰に映る日の出や雪ほのか。ねぎらいの紅茶にさらなる秋の夜。高峰を背に千変の秋の月。呼び返す小玉にゆるる秋の水。せせらぎに足をやむる谷もみじ。高峰の裾を広ごる秋館。
Sometime in the 1970s or 1980s, we're not entirely sure when, the Solberg family was plowing their fields when, thunk, they hit something buried in the ground. Now, no farmer likes that feeling, but for the Solbergs, it was doubly unsettling because they knew that that particular section of ground had been a graveyard 30 or 40 years earlier. Still, whatever they'd hit felt too hard to be wood or something more unpleasant, so they dug down to see what it was. What they found was a large stone, about 200 pounds, smoothed over, and someone had carved Japanese writing into its surface. They took the stone home, and a few years later, a Japanese-American woman who was visiting the area heard about the stone and asked if she could see it. She explained that what was carved into the stone was a haiku that, when translated into English, read, "Mountain peak behind me, 1,000 barracks under an autumn moon." Her name was Mieko. Her father, Taketaro Azeka, had carved that stone himself. About 30 or 40 years earlier, when he and Mieko were two of about 120,000 Japanese Americans who had been forcibly removed from the West Coast during World War II. Taketaro and Mieko had been sent to the Heart Mountain Center, and it was there that he had written his haiku and carved it on the stone. But why did he create this stone? And why did he carve a haiku onto it? Hello, my name is Cally Steussy. Thank you for joining me today for a closer look at the haiku of Heart Mountain.
I'd like to start off with some historical context for those who perhaps are joining us for the first time. In 1941, about 90% of the Japanese American community in the mainland United States was living on the West Coast. This wasn't all that unusual. The Japanese American community was still very new at the time. About 1/3 of the Japanese Americans were the first generation Issei. In other words, they were the immigrants who had come from Japan to the United States. The remaining 2/3 were their American-born children, the second generation Nisei. Most of the Nisei were still in their teens or their early 20s. They were still really just starting to get to the stage where they were thinking about maybe settling down and starting families. So the community hadn't really had time to expand very far from where they'd first entered the United States. The other reason that they hadn't expanded very much is that the United States was not a very friendly environment for them. This was a period of intense anti-immigrant sentiment, and it was also a period when, for example, the Jim Crow laws were at their height. On the West Coast in particular, anti-Asian sentiment was extremely high. So it was not exactly the best time to be an immigrant from Asia. And then you get December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. And all of that hostility exploded. Within minutes of Pearl Harbor being announced, the rumors were flying that the Japanese Americans had conspired with the Japanese bombers, or that they were all secret agents working for the Japanese Empire, or that they were planting their crops in the shapes of arrows to point at important military facilities. Yes, that was one of the rumors going around. Anytime any of these rumors were investigated, it always turned out to be nothing. But a lot of people believed them. including the general in charge of the defense of the West Coast. So finally, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order gave the military the right to exclude anyone for any reason from any area that the American military deemed important to the defense of the United States. Shortly after those orders were signed, these signs started going up in Japanese American neighborhoods. Japanese ancestry was defined as having at least one great-great-grandparent who was Japanese. That was how General DeWitt defined it. If you lived on the West Coast and you met that criteria, once these signs went up, you had about 2 weeks to decide what you were going to do with anything that you could not carry with you, from your house to your family pet. You could decide if you were putting it in storage or selling everything or asking someone to look after it. And after that, you were rounded up and sent to what was called an assembly center. The assembly centers were generally racetracks or fairgrounds, pretty much any large facility that could quickly be converted to a holding area for a large group of people. Because when these orders went out, the American Army hadn't even decided where they were going to send all of these people, let alone actually built the necessary facilities. Ultimately, however, they settled on 10 locations in the interior of the country, and the Japanese Americans of the West Coast, about 120,000 people, were shipped out to these 10 camps. Heart Mountain was the northernmost of these camps. It was also the fourth largest. Over the years that it was active, it had a total population of 14,000 people, although its highest population at any one time was 10,767 people. Among those people were Taketaro Azeka and his family. So, to return to the haiku stone, first of all, we need to ask an important question. What is haiku? Most Americans are familiar with a haiku as a traditional form of Japanese poetry that is built around a 5-7-5 syllable structure. So 3 lines, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables. That's true as far as it goes. It also describes quite a few other forms of Japanese poetry. In order to be a haiku, the poem has to include a few other elements. The first of these is kigo. A haiku must include one and only one kigo. Kigo translates to season word. The idea of a kigo is that it anchors a haiku at a particular time of year. So, for example, you might think of fireworks as a kigo for summer and parade as a kigo specifically for July. You might also consider snow as a kigo for winter, although interestingly in Japan, snow only applies to the month of January. I guess it doesn't snow quite so much in Japan. The other interesting aspect of haiku, and in many ways the more important aspect, is that a haiku is supposed to speak to the human condition through imagery. And this means a couple of things. The first is that there is no I in a haiku. There is no speaker. Haiku are supposed to evoke rather than explain. So you don't want someone saying, I felt this. Instead, a haiku builds an image. And the idea is that a well-constructed haiku can evoke an intense emotion through the image without ever needing to refer to a person and without ever needing to name the emotion involved. So, for example, let's take another look at the haiku from the stone. First, the 5-7-5 syllable structure. Let me just say I really admire Mieko's work at translating this because she actually managed to get a translation that is 17 syllables. However, for those who do not speak Japanese, I have included, by highlighting it, the breakdown of the 3 lines in the Japanese form of the haiku. Takamine o se ni senhen no aki no tsuki. And if you're curious, the N in senken, the N's there are each counted as individual syllables. It's a quirk of Japanese. Next, the kigo. Now, I don't think any of us have any trouble guessing what season this poem is about, the word autumn being exactly in it. But there's an interesting little subtlety here. The kigo in this isn't necessarily the autumn moon phrase, it's moon. Within the haiku tradition, the moon is associated with the autumn. And so, in fact, Azeka didn't need to include autumn at all. Simply by having moon there, he has locked this haiku as an autumn haiku. On the other hand, by including the full phrase autumn moon, aki no tsuki in Japanese, it does come out nicely to the 5 syllables he needs for the end of his line. But it also really emphasizes the autumn aspect. By the way, if anyone's curious, the explanation I have seen for why moon is associated with the autumn is because autumn is the time of year when the skies are clear, but it's not so cold that you're not willing to go outside at night. Setting the kigo aside, there's the first person's perspective. And I imagine some of you raised your eyebrows when I said that you weren't supposed to have a haiku speaking in first person, because indeed, when Mieko translated this, she wrote my shoulder. I suspect that she did this because it flows much better in English. But interestingly, if you did a literal and less, poetically beautiful translation, you would end up with something like this: mountain peak behind, 1,000 barracks of the autumn moon. And there's a couple interesting subtleties here. For one thing, you don't say under the moon, it's of. And second of all, the behind doesn't give you a person. It could easily mean that the mountain peak is behind the barracks. Either way, the image that you get here is a very vivid one. The moonlight, the mountain, and all of the barracks lined out under it in the cool light of autumn. Speaking of which, that mountain, I'd like to just point out one little interesting detail here, and that is the word peak. Now, Mieko translated this as mountain peak. The literal translation is more high peak or tall peak. The interesting part is peak. You see, the character for mountain in Japanese is this. Mountain in Japanese, yama, was sometimes used to talk about Heart Mountain, or it was just used as a form of shorthand if you didn't want to write out all of Heart Mountain. You could just say heart and then throw in the character for mountain. However, when talking about the mountain itself, within the Japanese-speaking community at Heart Mountain, it was pretty traditional for them to use the Japanese characters for heart and the character for peak, the one that is highlighted in gold here. This is really interesting because most mountains in Japan aren't called that. I mean, think about it in English. How many mountains do we have that are named peak? So this was a very unusual phrase, and it was always specifically used to talk about the actual mountain to the west of the camp. You didn't use the word peak to talk about the camp itself. That was reserved for Heart Mountain itself. So by using this particular character, although Azeka did not spell it out explicitly, he's anchoring this haiku not only in autumn, but at the Heart Mountain camp. So why haiku? Why did he choose a haiku for the stone that he buried at the Heart Mountain graveyard? Well, one possibility is he was deliberately evoking a Japanese tradition known as kuhi. Kuhi are stones with haiku carved into them. In Japan, they typically appear as monuments and occasionally as road signs. And the haiku carved into them is usually one of the haiku composed by the poet known as Basho, who is the elderly gentleman taking a nap in the drawing next to this picture. The kuhi first started around the year 1700, and they were originally raised by followers of Basho. Basho was considered in many ways the father of haiku, although, as a fun little aside, the word haiku and the exact codification of what it meant wasn't actually settled completely until the late 1800s. But today there are about 3,000 of these kuhi in Japan. One of the interesting differences between Azeka's stone and the kuhi is that kuhi are monuments. They are meant to be seen. Azeka buried his stone. But according to Mieko, he did that because he was afraid that after the camp closed, this history was going to be forgotten. All memory of the camps would simply be erased. So he buried his stone, hoping that someday in the future, archaeologists would find it and they would be able to uncover this lost history. There may be another reason that he chose to include a haiku, and that is because Heart Mountain actually had a very lively haiku community. It's important to understand that haiku is a remarkably democratic art form. Anyone who spoke Japanese and therefore probably had been educated in Japan would know the basics of writing haiku. Haiku was part of the basic educational curriculum in Japan at the time. So any of the first generation Issei, and also any Kibei, who were second generation Nisei who'd been sent back to Japan for schooling, would have learned how to write haiku. And the thing about haiku is, it's pretty easy to get into. All you need is something to write on, something to write with, and an experience. And that experience might actually have been important. Depression was a very real problem at the Japanese American camps. And so an art form that encouraged you to go out and look at the natural world around you, to get those experiences that you could then crystallize down into that one key image, could be very important. In addition, haiku, because they are designed explicitly to be, well, not explicit. The fact that you can express emotion without actually saying what it is might have been a comfort for many people who were aware that anything that got into publication was going to have censors looking at it. And even worse than censors, a wider public that would be eager to read any hint of complaint as a sign of disloyalty. The haiku gave a way for these people to express feelings that, in some cases, they were even ashamed of feeling, without needing to be explicit about it. In addition, one of the nice things about haiku is they are socially flexible. You can be an independent haiku writer, going out and observing the world around you and scribing your haiku. But the haiku tradition also has a strong tradition of what are called haiku kai. These are gatherings where people would get together and usually submit poems anonymously, and then people would analyze the poems, offer critiques, offer suggestions on how to improve them. It was a social occasion. And indeed, at Heart Mountain, there were a number of poetry societies. Probably the most famous was the Heart Yama Ginsha, or the Heart Mountain Poetry Society. It was headed in part by Satoru Shise Tsuneishi. Tsuneishi was an editor of haiku, so he was a professional at haiku. He had helped with the Shinsekai Asahi Shimbun, which was a very popular magazine in the newspaper in the Japanese American community. Interestingly, Tsuneishi was also a quiet but strong supporter of the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee. This was the group of young men who said that they were ready and willing to answer the draft to fight in Europe if and only if their families were released from these camps. Ultimately, the Fair Play Committee were all tried and convicted as draft resistors. And that particular story has been a painful one in the Heart Mountain community because of the division between people who supported it and those who did not. Tsuneishi was a supporter of the Heart Mountain resistors. Other leaders of the Heart Mountain Poetry Society were Shiro Muin Fujioka. He was an editor of Rafu Shimpo, and he also had been very diligent about trying to promote Japanese and American friendship before the outbreak of the war. The other major leaders that we know about are Mr. and Mrs. Hosoe. Unfortunately, we don't actually know anything else about this couple. All we have are their names and the fact that they were involved in this poetry society. So I guess this is, in a way, a shout out to anyone who perhaps knows a little bit more about this. Next is the question of publication, because many of these poetry societies before the camps would occasionally produce little booklets of their poetry. At Heart Mountain, one of the major outlets for publication was the Heart Mountain Sentinel, the newspaper. Unfortunately, though, the Japanese language section of the Heart Mountain Sentinel in particular was very, very limited on space. And so, naturally, it had to prioritize news, particularly news about events happening in the camp. However, for special occasions, such as the New Year's, which is the edition you see here, the Heart Mountain Sentinel would include a section set aside specifically for poetry. The other major outlet for creative arts at Heart Mountain in Japanese was the Hato Mountain Bungei. Heart Mountain, that's pretty straightforward. Bungei, the closest translation would be liberal arts. The Heart Mountain Bungei included essays, fiction, but mostly it was comprised of poetry in many different styles. It would range from haiku to senryu to tanka. Those are all traditional Japanese poetry. It also included long-form poetry and free-form styles. The Heart Mountain Bungei was edited by Yoshiaki Iwamuro, who was a Kibei, one of the Nisei who went back to Japanese, or who was sent back to Japan by his family for an education. And then Tadashige Okubo. This Tadashige Okubo was a younger Issei, so he was an immigrant from Japan, But both of these people were very involved in the literary community on the West Coast before being sent to Heart Mountain. In addition, the cover art was done by Estelle Ishigo, who is a well-known artist from Heart Mountain. She's known for the art she made of daily life at the camp. And she's also known because she was a Caucasian woman who was married to a Japanese man. And she decided to go to Heart Mountain with him rather than be separated. The Heart Mountain Bungei didn't run for very long. It was produced monthly from January to September of 1943, although it looks like there was never any June or August edition. It was discontinued when the last of its editors left Heart Mountain. It did include some rather famous contributors. Among them, Shisei Tsuneishi again. He contributed a number of things. One of the most interesting was a 2-installment article called How to Understand Haiku. Tsuneishi was a professional haiku editor and writer. And so, as he explained in the opening of his essay, because the Japanese-speaking community already knew the basics of haiku, he saw this as a chance to say, okay, here's a more in-depth look at how we understand haiku and how editors in particular look at a haiku and decide which ones are the strongest. Another famous contributor to the Heart Mountain Bungei is Nyogen Senzaki, who is sometimes known as the father of American Zen. He was a Zen priest. He wrote several essays. One was titled Pragmatism and Zen, which was a bit more on the philosophical side. And he also wrote an essay called Sesso no Hanashi, which roughly translates to something like Comments of a Humble Priest. Another contributor to the Heart Mountain Bungei was Taketaro Azeka. He contributed a number of haiku collections. For example, in the second edition of the Heart Mountain Bungei, he submitted a collection that was dedicated to the Japanese New Year. He also submitted an essay, which was simply a description of his experience of the Japanese-American New Year at Heart Mountain, interspersed with haiku, so that you could follow the essay and his description of how the celebrations went, and then he would crystallize that description in a 17-syllable haiku. So you could really see how he was pulling things together. In addition to those, however, in the very first edition of the Heart Mountain Bungei, the very first issue, he submitted a collection that he simply titled Celebration, or possibly Celebration of the Publication of the Bungei. And, well, the interesting thing about this particular collection, if you've been paying attention, then you probably noticed that that third haiku is pretty familiar. In fact, this collection is the one that I read at the start of this presentation. Now, at this point, I would like to throw in a disclaimer. I am not a literary translator, nor have I a speck of poetry in my soul. You've probably noticed that I didn't even try to get my translations to actually be 17-syllable haiku. So if anyone in the audience watching this feels inspired to try their own hand at these haiku, by all means, feel free to drop your contributions in the comments section. For now, I included these translations so that those among us who do not read Japanese could get a sense of what these haikus said. And also so that I could speak at least briefly about some of the interesting things about this set of haiku. One of the more interesting parts about it is the question of, were these always intended to go together? It's possible not. It's not uncommon for haiku writers, when they are getting ready to publish things, to go through and curate their own work, pick out which poems they think are the best, and organize them together. One of the interesting aspects to this particular collection is that, well, 4 of the 6 haiku all have the word autumn in them. This is a very autumn collection, especially when you consider that the red maple leaves in that 5th haiku, that is very, very classic autumn imagery. The interesting part here is that first line and the word snow. You may remember me mentioning earlier, snow is a winter kegel. And specifically, it's a January kegel, which is doubly interesting because the very first issue of the Heart Mountain Bunge was released in January, which means that in order for this collection to have been published with it, it was submitted in December. This was the 1st December and the 1st January at Heart Mountain for the Japanese Americans. So either Azeka was reusing an old haiku, which is possible, but the fact that he included that high peak, that reference to Heart Mountain that I talked about earlier, it seems unlikely. This was probably written at Heart Mountain. So he may have simply decided he needed to use a kegel that was slightly out of context, which actually brings up a really interesting topic. You see, within the haiku writing community, the kegel topic is one of intense debate, because what do you do if you are living in a country that happens to have different seasonal markers than Japan does? So it's interesting to ask. Snow comes early in Wyoming, and that first winter, the winter of 1942 and 1943, was the coldest on record in Wyoming to date. So it's possible that when he wrote this haiku, Azeka had decided that in order to be true to the world he was looking at, he needed to bend the rules on kegel and declare snow a autumn kegel. On the other hand, going back to those red maple leaves, you don't see those in Wyoming. I'm sorry, at least not in this region. So either he decided in that case to simply use a traditional Japanese kegel, or he was adjusting the meaning of momiji, the Japanese word, a little bit. It's possible that in this case, rather than red maple leaves, he was thinking about golden aspen. There's one last detail that I would like to touch on before I finish, and that is the date. I blew past this when I first talked about this stone, but there's actually something really interesting about that date, August 26th, 1942. You see, according to the official records kept by the War Relocation Agency, that being the organization in charge of these camps, Taketaro Azeka and his family arrived on August 27th. So why is it that this stone is dated one day before he is listed as arriving? Now, it's entirely possible that he meant to simply date the stone by the day that he arrived at the camp, and one could understand him perhaps having other things to worry about than the exact day. But another possibility, and this is my theory, I freely admit, he may have arrived late enough that he and his family were processed the next morning, in which case the date on this stone is the date that the haiku was written. And in that case, this haiku reflects Azeka's very first impression of Heart Mountain. And in many cases, it would have been the first impression of many of those Japanese Americans confined here during World War II. The mountain in the background, row upon row of tar paper barrack, and an autumn moon overhead. And just as an interesting closing detail for you, it turns out that the night of August 26, 1942, was a full moon.
Once again, thank you for joining me for today's talk about the haiku of Heart Mountain. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section and I will respond as quickly as I can. In addition, I'd like to invite you to take a look at some of the other online content that the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center has been producing recently. In particular, I would like to invite you to sign in on Wednesday if you are curious about the painting that I used as my theme picture for this presentation. On Wednesday, our registrar, my colleague, Brandon, will be talking about the art of Miyauchi, one of the most prolific painters at Heart Mountain. Once again, thank you and have a good day.